when I checked my mailbox, expecting the usual stack of bills and junk mail. But there, amid the clutter, was a crisp, official-looking letter. It had the Simmons Valley Homeowners Association seal embossed on the top. I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't heard from the HOA in months, and the last time I did, it was a simple reminder about lawn care. But this letter, this one looked different. I opened it carefully and scanned the page quickly. The letter read, "Notice of violation. Your property at address is in violation of HOA regulations due to an unauthorized structure. Immediate action required. Remove the fence installed on your property within 30 days or face a fine and possible eviction." I blinked. A fine? Eviction? The letter went on to state that I had violated a community standard for fence design and placement and was being fined a $2,500 fine. I couldn't believe my eyes. I'd had that fence up for over 5 years. It was the same fence I'd put in after receiving approval from the HOA back when I first moved in. I stared at the letter in disbelief. There was no clear explanation. No specific measurement or technical issue with the fence. Just a blanket accusation. The letter didn't even offer a chance to explain or negotiate. It was a simple take it down or pay up threat. I couldn't help but feel like this was some kind of power grab. Who were they to threaten eviction over something so trivial? The more I read it, the angrier I got. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I didn't waste any time. I immediately called the HOA office and requested to speak with Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. I was ready to get to the bottom of this and clear up what was clearly a misunderstanding. When Karen finally picked up, I didn't waste any pleasantries. "Karen, I received a violation notice for my fence, and I need to understand exactly what the issue is. There's nothing wrong with it. It was approved years ago." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "Mr. Callahan, this is a new issue. The design and height of the fence no longer meet our community standards. We've had complaints from other residents who feel it's an eyesore, and it doesn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood." "Complaints?" I asked, my patience thinning. "I've lived here for over 5 years, and no one has ever said anything about the fence. This is the same fence that was approved when I installed it. How can you justify sending me a fine now?" "Well, Mr. Callahan," she said, her tone noticeably more defensive, "the board recently revised the guidelines, and the new rules are more strict about exterior features. We've been enforcing them across the neighborhood, and your fence is now out of compliance. We've sent notices to other residents, too." I couldn't believe it. The rules had changed without notice, and now I was being penalized for something that had been perfectly acceptable just a few months ago. "You're telling me this fine is based on changes to the rules I wasn't even notified about?" "Well, yes," Karen said, her voice getting colder. "We did send out an email about the updated guidelines last month." An email? A vague email I probably skimmed. I hadn't seen any official communication. Nothing had come through that addressed these new changes. In fact, I checked my inbox, and there was no record of such an email. This wasn't just a vague accusation anymore. It was starting to smell like a power grab, and Karen was using the HOA's rules as a tool for control. I had spent enough years in law to know this wasn't right. "Karen," I said firmly, "this is not going to fly. I'm a property rights lawyer, and I know the law. You've overstepped your boundaries, and I won't stand for this kind of harassment. I'm not taking down my fence." She hesitated, but quickly recovered. "You'll have to take it up with the board then. We're enforcing the rules, and you have 30 days to comply, or we'll proceed with a fine and eviction." I hung up the phone, my blood boiling. 30 days? Eviction over a fence. I wasn't going to let this stand. I had the tools to fight this, and I was going to win. I wasn't about to let Karen and her HO board get away with this nonsense. I knew I had to do more than just argue with them. I had to dig deeper and uncover their true motives. As a property rights lawyer, I was used to analyzing legal loopholes, but my background as an IRS auditor gave me a whole new set of tools for this battle. I went straight to work. The first step was to request the HOA's official documents, their budget, any fines or fees they collected over the past year, and most importantly, meeting minutes where they might have discussed these new guidelines that had suddenly appeared. I also started combing through the community's financial records. An HOA is supposed to be transparent, and it's their duty to report where the money from fines, fees, and assessments goes. I was determined to find out if this fine was part of a larger scheme. As I went through the HOA's financials, I noticed something odd. They had received a large payment from a company that specialized in neighborhood beautification services. The payment was listed under the category consulting fees, but the amount seemed far too high for what was essentially a couple of landscaping projects. I followed the trail. The company, I learned, had connections to several board members. In fact, Karen Whitmore herself had received a significant kickback in the form of a consulting bonus that she had personally signed off on, without any official board approval. The pieces started to fall into place. The fines and violations weren't about keeping the neighborhood pristine. They were a way to generate revenue for projects that benefited Karen and her cronies. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules for the good of the community. They were using the fines as a cash grab. Armed with this information, I was ready to confront Karen again. But this time, I was coming prepared. I wasn't just going to argue against the fine. I was going to expose her for abusing her position to line her pockets. I wasn't about to sit back and let Karen and the HO get away with their shady business practices. Armed with evidence of illegal financial transactions and unlawful fines, I sat down to draft a formal response that would make it clear I wasn't some homeowner to be pushed around. I carefully outlined everything I had discovered, the illegal fines, the kickbacks from the beautification company, and the fact that the HOA had violated its own bylaws in order to push through illegitimate penalties. I also included the lack of proper notification about the new fence policies and the lack of transparency about the HOA's finances. I made sure to reference the legal precedent that supported my claims, as well as my property rights and due process under state law. The letter was thorough, direct, and non-negotiable. Here's what I wrote in the opening paragraph. Dear Ms. Whitmore and the Simmons Valley HOA Board, this letter serves as a formal response to the recent violation notice issued against me concerning a fence that has been in place for over 5 years with prior approval from the HOA. The recent fine of $2,500 and the threat of eviction are not only unwarranted but also reflect an abuse of power, which I will not tolerate. This letter outlines my legal position and demands that the fine be immediately rescinded and that any further action be halted. I also demanded that the HOA reimburse me for the distress this has caused, as well as for the unjust fines levied against me. The letter made it clear that if they didn't withdraw the fine and cease harassment, I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office and pursuing a lawsuit for abuse of power and defamation. I also mentioned the kickbacks I'd uncovered, setting the stage for a much bigger legal battle. I didn't send the letter through regular mail. I hand-delivered it to Karen's office, ensuring that I got a signed receipt of delivery. As soon as I handed it to her, I could see the look of concern in her eyes. She knew that things were about to get serious. It didn't take long for Karen to respond. I'd expected some pushback, but nothing could have prepared me for the desperation in her voice when she called me that evening. Mr. Callahan, she started, her tone defensive, I've reviewed your letter, and I think we may have misunderstood the situation. We certainly didn't mean for this to escalate. I didn't let her finish. You didn't mean for it to escalate? I asked, my voice steady but full of authority. You've been harassing me and other homeowners for months, issuing fines without cause. Now, you're telling me that this is a misunderstanding. She hesitated, clearly not prepared for this level of confrontation. We're willing to discuss this, but I think you're making a bigger deal out of this than it is. I could hear the anxiety creeping into her voice now, something I hadn't heard when she was sending me threats and demanding that I take down my fence. I pressed on. No, Karen, this is a big deal. You've been targeting residents for bogus fines and then pocketing the money. I've already sent the legal response, and I've got all the evidence I need to prove you've been abusing your position. You have two options: withdraw the fine and drop the eviction threat, or face legal action for defamation and fraud. I could hear her frantically flipping through papers on the other end of the line. Mr. Callahan, I think we can work something out. I'll bring it up with the board tomorrow. We'll take a closer look at the situation. Karen, I cut her off. This isn't about negotiation. I've already outlined the legal consequences in my letter. I'm not backing down. There was a long silence, and I knew she was trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Then she spoke again, her voice much more subdued. Fine, she said, almost resigned. We'll cancel the fine and the eviction order. We'll revisit the fence policy and make sure it aligns with community standards. Good. And make sure to send me a written apology. I'll be expecting the check for the fines you've wrongfully imposed on me as well. Karen didn't respond right away, but I could tell she was angry. She'd lost this round, and she knew it. The next day, I received an email from the HOA. They were retracting the fine and would no longer pursue the eviction. They also assured me that they'd be reviewing their bylaws to avoid future confusion. It was a victory. But it wasn't just about the fine. It was about making sure the HOA knew it couldn't push people around anymore. The victory wasn't complete yet. The HOA had retracted the fine and dropped the eviction threat, but I wasn't satisfied with just that. They'd gone too far in their attempt to control me, and I wasn't going to let them off the hook so easily. The next step was to hold them accountable for the emotional distress and harassment I'd endured. I'd already sent the letter and gotten the fine retracted, but now it was time to make sure they paid for the inconvenience they'd caused. I sent Karen another letter, this time with more legal precision. In the letter, I demanded the following: a written apology from Karen and the HOA board, acknowledging the mistake and the unjust fine, compensation for legal fees and the distress caused by their actions, $10,000, seemed like a reasonable amount to cover the time I'd spent dealing with this nonsense and the emotional toll it had taken on me. A public statement in the community newsletter, admitting that the fine was issued in error and that they would be reviewing the HOA's bylaws to ensure this would never happen again. I wasn't asking for much, but I knew it was important to set a precedent. Homeowners shouldn't be afraid to stand up to the HOA, especially when it's clear that the HOA is overstepping its bounds. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for everyone in the neighborhood who had been pushed around by Karen and her cronies. I made it clear in the letter that if my demands weren't met, I would take legal action for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. The HOA would face a lawsuit, and I had no doubt that they would lose. The next day, I got a call from Karen. She was livid. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice strained, "we've agreed to retract the fine, and now you're demanding money? This is getting out of hand." I didn't back down. "Karen, this isn't just about the fine anymore. It's about what your actions have done to me and to this community. You can't just harass residents and get away with it. I'm giving you a chance to make this right." There was a long pause, and I could tell she was weighing her options. Then, to my surprise, she spoke in a much quieter tone. "Fine. We'll agree to your terms. We'll issue the apology and compensate you for your legal fees and distress. But know this, Mr. Callahan, we won't forget this." I wasn't concerned with her threats anymore. I'd won. The HOA had been forced to apologize, and I made sure they were held accountable for their actions. The community had seen the truth, and I had set a precedent that they couldn't ignore. With the fine retracted and the HOA forced to apologize, things started to calm down, temporarily. But I knew that Karen and the rest of the board wouldn't give up so easily. They'd lost a round, but I could feel the tension lingering. This was just one small victory in the larger battle to reclaim control of our community. The real change began when I reached out to my neighbors. After everything that had happened, I knew it was time to bring the community together to ensure that no one else had to go through what I just endured. I called a meeting at the community center, inviting anyone who was interested in discussing HOA reform and how we could protect homeowners' rights moving forward. The turnout was incredible. People I'd never spoken to before were showing up, eager to have their voices heard. Some were old-timers who had lived in Simmons Valley for decades. Others were newcomers who had just settled in. But one thing was clear: we were all united in our desire for change. At the meeting, I stood in front of the crowd, sharing my story. I explained how Karen and the board had overstepped their authority, how they had harassed me, and how the community had stood by and done nothing. "This isn't just about fences or parking fines," I said, addressing the crowd. "It's about protecting our rights as homeowners. It's about ensuring that no one can come in and try to bully us into submission. If we let this continue, it'll happen to more of us. We have to stand together." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, I saw real unity among the residents. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. We couldn't let this kind of abuse of power continue. I went on to propose a new set of guidelines for how the HOA should operate, ones that would be transparent, fair, and representative of the entire community. I also suggested that we create a committee of residents who would review any complaints or fines before they were imposed, ensuring that the community had a voice in every decision. By the end of the meeting, we had already formed a reform committee. And it wasn't just me leading the charge anymore. There were now dozens of residents who were willing to step up and make sure the HOA couldn't overreach again. The reforms were in motion, but I knew that Karen and the board wouldn't back down without a fight. They had been operating with impunity for so long, and the idea of losing control was something they could hardly accept. I'd already seen their arrogance in action, and I wasn't about to let them simply retreat and regroup. I decided that it was time to take the next step. With the community behind me, it was time to hold the HOA legally accountable for their actions. The legal pressure I had applied before had worked, but now it was time to escalate. I began consulting with fellow lawyers who specialized in HOA abuses and fraud. Together, we started compiling all the evidence, the fines, the illegal financial transactions, and the violation notices that were clearly out of bounds. This was more than just a personal battle now. It was about ensuring that the whole community could never be targeted like this again. I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, outlining the HOA's repeated offenses and their failure to comply with state laws regarding community organizations. The complaint included detailed records, emails, and evidence showing how the board had been taking unwarranted action against residents. In addition, I reached out to local news outlets. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was a community issue. I wanted the world to see how one corrupt HOA could affect an entire neighborhood. The first news story hit a few days later. Simmons Valley HOA under investigation for fraud and misuse of power. The report included interviews with residents, footage of the reform meeting, and expert commentary on how Karen and the board had been exploiting their position for personal gain. The public outrage was immediate, and the pressure on the HOA to account for their actions grew. The State Attorney General's office launched an official investigation, and soon the HOA was under scrutiny for not only mismanagement but also for their abusive practices. They had to answer for the thousands of dollars in fines they had unjustly levied on residents. Within a few weeks, Karen and several board members were forced to resign. They were no longer able to control the HOA, and the investigation into their finances and actions was only just beginning. The investigation into the HOA's practices only deepened, and it didn't take long for the State Attorney General's office to uncover the full extent of the illegal actions that had been taking place behind the scenes. The resignations of Karen and the board members were only the beginning. As the legal team dug through the HOA's financial records, they discovered falsified documents, unlawful fines, and evidence of kickbacks. It was clear now that the HOA had been exploiting residents for years, lining their pockets at the expense of the community. The state issued a formal ruling that the HOA was to be dismantled immediately, and the community was given the right to elect a new board. The court also ruled that all unjust fines would be reversed, and residents would receive full reimbursement for any payments made under duress. The news hit like a wave of relief. I was flooded with calls, texts, and emails from my neighbors, all thanking me for taking action and standing up for them. For the first time in years, we felt like we were in control again. We held an emergency election to form a new HOA board, one that would be made up of residents who genuinely cared about the community. The new board members were selected based on transparency, honesty, and commitment to the neighborhood. We weren't going to let this happen again. And as the new board began the work of rebuilding the HOA's reputation, I knew we had turned a corner. The community was stronger than ever, and we had shown that we could fight back against corruption and make sure that justice was served. The final step came when the State Attorney General's office confirmed that Karen and several other board members were being investigated for criminal charges related to their abuse of power. They would soon face the legal consequences of their actions, and it was a relief to know that they wouldn't just walk away from this.